Okay, welcome and Valcha. This is another edition of Random Thoughts from County Antrim. And I'm your host, David McDonnell. And this is my half hour to tell some stories or some yarns, some historical tidbits, and a variety of other things, including my random thoughts. Now, where should I begin? Probably should tell you about my week. I went to four different doctors this week. And I had, apart from that, I had a couple of additional diagnostic tests. Now, you might think from that I have a serious ailment, and I semi-do, but that's not the reason that I went to four different doctors this week. These were all routine visits, as well as the two diagnostics. And they had been scheduled over 3 or 4 months in the spring. So I had one in March, one scheduled in April, one in May, one in June. And they had all been canceled as a result of the pandemic. Routine doctor visits were not allowed during the shelter-in-place period, which was very long and may get reinstated soon. But they just started opening up, and coincidentally, I got a call from each of the doctor's office scheduling me for an appointment this past week. So I had one after another. And that was my get out of the house routine, is go to the doctors or go to get some tests. Not a lot of fun, but way overdue, so I'm glad I did it. Now, if any of you have delayed a routine doctor's appointment, do it now, because the doctor's offices are amazingly uncrowded. Every facility I walked in, they screen you as you walk in the door. They wouldn't allow you in a waiting room till they checked it to see if it was crowded. When I went in to see one physician, for example, the waiting room was empty. And you know how you normally go in the waiting room and it's full and you have an hour or two to wait to get in? That's not the case now. I went in, checked in, boom, saw the doctor, got done, went over to get some lab work, walked over to the lab. No one was there but the lab tech, drew my blood, said goodbye, and I went home, waiting for the next appointment. But where doctor visits normally can take half a day because doctors are busy and you wait a long time, it's not the case now. So if you've been putting it off, don't. Go ahead. Wear your mask, do all the safe things, but go see your doctor if you can, because appointments are still very, very hard to get. Now, these doctor visits kind of reminded me of a story, which I'm going to tell you. And this is an absolute true story. And it's about my near-death experience a few years ago. Now, I know when you hear I'm going to tell you about a near-death experience, you're going to want to turn off this podcast and go on and do something else. But I'll warn you, it's a humorous story, and it was a near-death. Had I actually died, I think it would have been a hilarious story. In part because I think I would have made the medical journals. As the only man who ever died of this condition. It's a condition which affects women far too often. And frankly, I don't know if it affects transgender people. I just don't know one way or the other. I don't know if there's data on it. But I know it has never affected a man before. So here's the story. I was in Ireland a few years ago. Leaving Ireland, we had a flight from Dublin to Chicago's O'Hare Airport. And from over here, we had a couple hour layover to go to Traverse City, which is the nearest airport to our home in County Antrim, Michigan. Now, I got on the plane. It's a typical flight transatlantic in that it's all night long. Got on the flight in the evening and started westbound over the Atlantic. And it wasn't too long in the flight where I began to feel nauseous. Terribly nauseous. And I'm not one who gets air sick. I've never have been air sick or car sick. And it was a terrible, terrible feeling. And I wanted to reach over to the seat in front of me and grab the air sick bag. But I was afraid to do so because I was afraid to move. Because I figured if I moved, I would certainly lose it. So I stayed put. I just endured this terrible, terrible, nauseous feeling. And then after a while, and again, when you're going through this, it's hard to tell whether it's seconds or minutes or hours. It just seemed like forever. But after a while, the nausea wasn't the worst part. I started feeling this tingling in my arms and my legs, and it kind of felt like they were not attached to my body. They were just kind of floating around. And I didn't seem to have control. I don't think I was even moving, but it had the feel like they were moving detached from my body. Weird feeling. You know, I had a torso and then I had arms and legs floating around in the plane. That's the feeling I had. And that continued for quite a while. And then that didn't become the worst of it. I then began to sweat profusely. I mean, water was just pouring out of my head and over my body. My shirt was soaking wet. It was chilly when we left Ireland. And so I was wearing, besides a shirt, I was wearing a fleece. And I was so hot and sweating so badly that I wanted to take my fleece off. But I was afraid to move. Because I was afraid if I moved to take the fleece off, my nausea would take over and I would lose it. So that cold sweats, just continued for, again, seemed like forever. And then all of a sudden I got cold. I started to shiver. And I don't know how I got it. I assume it was at the time, I assumed it was my wife. Gave me a blanket. And by then I was glad I kept my fleece on, and I had the fleece and a blanket, and I was still cold. I was still just shivering. And I was feeling so bad that I really, really thought I was going to die. I was convinced. And it got to a point where I actually wanted to die. And I wished, although I didn't say anything because I was kind of unable to talk. Storyteller, unable to talk, but it's true. What I wished is that they would carry me down to the cargo hold, open the hatch, and just throw me out. I figured it's time. I had a good life. I've been happy. This is the way to go, because I just didn't want to continue to endure this. And I thought, being my body forever in the Atlantic, somewhere between Ireland and the United States, would be the perfect place to rest for eternity. So that's what I wanted. And I felt that way for quite a while. And then suddenly, eventually, I fell asleep. And I slept from that point on. And again, I don't know where the heck we were at the time. But from that point on until just about landing in Chicago. Now, when I landed, began, the process. I felt a little better. We began the process of getting our things together to deplane. And the flight attendants kept coming up to me one by one. They said, "Oh, you look so much better." And passengers came up to me and said, "Oh, we were so worried about you." And I was thinking to myself, I thought this was a private anguish. I had no idea and could not imagine why every passenger and every flight attendant in the plane knew all about it. And that's when I heard from my wife that she was very concerned, thought that I was having a heart attack, probably, knowing my wife, told everybody in the plane. But she did go to the flight attendants in particular, hoping for some assistance. And what she got wasn't at all reassuring. When she told a flight attendant that she thought her husband was having a heart attack, the flight attendant sort of just put her hands to her mouth and screamed, "Ah!" It was obvious she didn't know what to do. And flight attendants are trained in many, many things and are skilled personnel. But evidently they haven't been trained on what to do with a passenger who's having a heart attack. So they were very kind when I left. Evidently one of them was the one who gave me a blanket. But they had no idea what to do while I was going through my anguish. And when I left the plane, as we're getting ready to leave the plane, walked up to the front near the cockpit and the exit, the pilot kind of signaled me to come into the cockpit. And he said, "Oh, it's good to hear that you're feeling better. We were all worried about you." And he said, "We have been cleared for landing, an emergency landing in Nova Scotia. And I was planning the route where I would dump fuel over the Atlantic and land in Nova Scotia for the emergency landing and drop you off there." And he said, "Just about the time I had to make a decision whether I was going to go that route, that's when I heard that you fell asleep. So fortunately, that's when I decided to make the full trip to Chicago, and fortunately we did not have to land in Nova Scotia, but I wanted you to know that we were prepared." So he didn't talk about the third alternative. I mean, obviously the alternative was continue to Chicago or an emergency landing in Nova Scotia. The third alternative, which was simply to take me down to the cargo hold, throw me out the back of the plane. He didn't mention that one. I'm sure he thought of it, but he was being kind and not suggesting that as one of his alternatives that he was considering. So we made it to Chicago, and we had a couple-hour layover before we flew to Traverse City. So what I wanted more than anything else was to walk around, and I would have preferred to go outside and get some fresh air, but to do so meant I would have had to come back through security to get back into O'Hare. So instead I just walked around the airport. And if you've ever been to O'Hare, you know it's a huge airport. You can walk for miles before you have to turn around and come back to the other direction. And that's what I did. I just took a long walk down the terminal. Then I turned around and head back to where our terminal was. And I was heading back. I saw this sign. And the sign was huge. It was like a billboard-sized sign, indoors, within the airport. And the sign, the banner at the top, said 5 symptoms of a female heart attack. Now, I know a little bit about anatomy. I know there are differences between men and women. Duh. But I didn't know there was any differences in their cardiovascular system. I mean, what's the difference between a male heart attack and a female heart attack? So the sign got my curiosity up. I wanted to know what's the difference between a male and a female heart attack. So I stopped and started reading the billboard. The billboard had 5 images, cartoon kind of images of women with text underneath. First image showed a woman with kind of wiggly lines in her stomach area. And her face was kind of a yellowish green. And it said, the text underneath said, the first symptom, a symptom of a female heart attack is nausea. And I thought, oh, I just had nausea. That's interesting that that's a heart attack symptom in females. Now the second picture showed a woman, cartoon figure of a woman, with lines coming out of her arms and legs. And the arms kind of dangling a bit. And it said the second symptom of a female heart attack is numbness of the arms and legs and feeling of detachment of the arms and legs. And as I looked at that, I go, wait a minute. That happened to me also. I have 2 signs of a female heart attack. So then I went to the third image. The third image had a drawing of a woman and just water pouring out of her body. Sweat. And a symptom, according to the text, of a female heart attack is profuse sweating. And I said to myself, this is starting to get creepy, because that happened to me. And now I have 3 symptoms or signs of a female heart attack. So then I looked at the fourth image. Fourth image had a woman with design that shows that she was shivering and she was wrapped in a blanket. And the text underneath it said that a symptom of a female heart attack is shivers and cold, extreme cold. And now I was worried because I had 4 symptoms. Just within a few hours ago, I had 4 symptoms of a female heart attack. Now, the 5th image showed a woman with like a corkscrew in her chest, wound really tight. And it said another symptom of a female heart attack is a tightening in the chest. And then I felt some relief because that did not happen to me. I did not have any chest pains or chest tightness while I was on that flight from Dublin to Chicago. But I thought about it a while and I go, wow, I had 4 out of 5 warning signs of a female heart attack. So I kind of put it out of my mind, and I went back to our terminal. We boarded our flight, flew to Traverse City, got home, immediately called my doctor, told him about the incident, made an appointment, went in, told him about my incident, and he ran me through a whole bunch of tests, EKG and others, and said, I have no evidence that you had any kind of incident, cardiovascular incident. So you did not have a heart attack. And as we talked about it a while, he said, may have been a reaction from your medications to the altitude. And I may not have had enough water either on the plane or before I got on the plane, so I may have been dehydrated, and it may have been a combination of the two. And that's the likely possible explanation of my anguish on the plane. But doctors and scientists, they rely on evidence. They rely on data. You can see this with the coronavirus, how we kept getting different messages and different suggestions and different warnings from professionals. And it's not because they were wrong. It's because they were relying on the evidence available to them at the time. And as more evidence came out, more studies, they changed their understanding of the coronavirus and changed their recommendations. And again, that's nobody's fault. It's just the scientists and the doctors relying on data, evidence. And that may be what's going on with my female heart attack. It may be that the doctor was relying on the evidence available. And also that when you have a mindset, you tend to ignore evidence that contradicts your mindset. And the fact that I'm a male, and he's a doctor who's inspected me thoroughly and he knows that I'm a male, was of a mindset that a male cannot have a female heart attack. So it may very well be that he discounted the evidence that he had and went with a different diagnosis. Now, as more evidence comes out, he may realize that he was mistaken in his diagnosis. And that's what I'm going to go with. I think what I had was a female heart attack. And had I died of it on that plane, and had they not thrown me out of the back and able to die, through autopsy or whatever, confirm that I had a female heart attack, I'm sure I would have made all the medical journals and would have changed everybody's opinion, all the professionals' opinion, about what and who can suffer from a female heart attack. Now that's my story. That was my near-death experience. Fortunately, I've not had a female heart attack since. Who knows what's going to be the final cause of death? COD, as they use in the medical world. But for me, it was not, at that point, a female heart attack. Now, last week, I told you a little bit about Move Me Brightly. Wonderful service offered by a registered nurse who works in pediatric oncology at University of Michigan's Children's Hospital. And she's made for quite a while headbands out of recycled material and head coverings. She gives head coverings to her patients who have lost their hair to chemo. But she's also made a number of headbands. And these headbands, she gave me some to sell at Irish festivals for her. And I've got a couple here that I grabbed with Irish themes. I sold a bunch of these for her at Irish festivals in 2019. I have not been to an Irish festival in 2020 and do not anticipate going to any. But in 2019, I sold a bunch of headbands, with these Irish themes. And they're made out of material she gets at resale shops. She buys a dress or something, cuts it up, does the sewing, adds the stretch stuff. It's got to be a certain fabric because it stretches a bit. I'd put this on, but I'm a terrible model. But they are wonderful headbands. Actually, when we sold them, because I think I gave one to a kid. And she wore it at the festival, and everybody was coming up to her and said, "I love your headband." And then they would come up to our booth and buy our headbands. But the site is Move Me Brightly. It's a Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at clandonnell.net. Clandonnell spelled like this. And I'll be glad to tell you where to find her. Now, she started making face masks. She makes some like this. She makes some with buttons. She makes some that are mounted a little differently. She wears a face mask every day, all day, when she's working, so she knows what's comfortable. There's all kinds of stretchy material and a thing around the nose. any material you want. She made this one for me. It's a plain old blue because I'm a plain old blue guy. But it works quite nicely. So think about getting a face mask from her. She is doing a buy one, give one program. If you buy one from her, she will give one to a frontline healthcare worker or EMS worker as part of a promotion. And nurses, they're overworked, very professional, thoroughly educated, dedicated, but overworked and underpaid. So if you know a nurse like this one who has a little entrepreneurial sideline, give them some business. It's a good way to say thank you to a frontline worker. One more commercial, and that is, since I didn't die of my female heart attack, I still tell stories. I still write, working on my third book. My first book is Clandonnell. My second book is By the Horse of Guinness. Check out my website, which is clandonnell.net. I have a Facebook page as Clandonnell, A Storied History of Ireland. And send me an email at clandonnell@gmail.com. I'll be glad to answer your questions, talk about whatever you want. Give me suggestions for next week. My plan is to do this podcast every Sunday night, at least during the pandemic, and I may or may not continue it thereafter. But that wraps it up for tonight. And don't forget, be safe, be careful, and do the right thing. So goodbye and shlán.